The water was 52 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the detail no history book emphasizes, the fact documented in declassified naval reports held at the National Archives, but absent from every memorial speech. 52 degrees. Cold enough that when the first ramps dropped on the Higgins boats, 600 yards from Omaha Beach at 0630 on the morning of June 6, 1944, and 32 men from Company A, 1st Battalion, 116th Infantry Regiment stepped into the surf, carrying 60 pounds of equipment. The cold hit their bodies like a physical blow. According to medical records from the 1st Infantry Division, archived at the Library of Congress, some men went into shock before the German machine guns even opened fire. The sound came next. Not the sound people imagine. Not dramatic movie soundtrack explosions. According to testimony from Sergeant Thomas Valance, archived at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, the first sound was a wet, mechanical clicking, the sound of MG-42 machine guns cycling at 1,200 rounds per minute from fortified positions on the bluffs above. Then the sound of those rounds hitting water, then hitting flesh, then screaming. The first 30 seconds killed more than half of Company A. The Naval History and Heritage Command documents that by 0631, 60 seconds after the ramps dropped, the surf at Dog Green sector of Omaha Beach had turned red for 30 feet in every direction from the disabled landing craft. Men thrashed in water mixed with their own blood, drowning under the weight of equipment designed to help them fight, while machine gun fire turned the surface into a boiling froth of white and crimson. This was not a battle. Not yet. This was industrial slaughter conducted with Teutonic precision against men who had nowhere to hide. No cover, no concealment. Nothing but 200 yards of open beach and the statistical certainty that most of them would die before reaching the seawall. Private Robert Sales, whose testimony is preserved in the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, remembered the smell. Salt water and copper. Blood has a smell. When there is enough of it, when it mixes with seawater and diesel fuel and cordite, it creates an odor that burns into memory. Sales remembered stepping over a man whose lower body was simply gone, the torso still breathing, still conscious, eyes looking up at a sky the color of concrete. Sales remembered that the man tried to speak. The statistical reality, documented across multiple archives, including declassified after-action reports from V Corps, makes clear what happened in the first hour at Omaha Beach. Of the 2,300 men who landed in the first wave, estimates suggest that 30% became casualties within 15 minutes. On certain sections of the beach, particularly Dog Green and Easy Red, the casualty rate in the first wave approached 90%. 90%. These were not numbers. These were men. 19-year-old farm boys from Virginia, 22-year-old factory workers from Pennsylvania, men who had written letters home the night before, letters that would arrive weeks later to families who would read them, knowing the hand that wrote those words had been shredded by machine gun fire before the ink had fully dried. But here is what the archives also reveal, what the official histories sometimes obscure beneath strategic analysis and tactical diagrams. They kept coming. Even as the first wave died in the surf, even as the beach became a killing ground that violated every principle of military assault, even as officers screamed into radios that the landing had failed, that Omaha was a massacre, that they needed to evacuate immediately, the second wave came, then the third, then the fourth. By 0700, there were 5,000 men on Omaha Beach. Most were pinned down behind beach obstacles, bodies piled behind Czech hedgehogs and Belgian gates, returning fire at an enemy they could barely see. The bluffs above them held positions the German Wehrmacht had spent 4 years fortifying. Bunkers with interlocking fields of fire. Artillery pre-sighted on every meter of beach. Mortars ranged to drop shells with mathematical precision on men with nowhere to run. The historical record, preserved across American and German archives, indicates that senior German commanders observing the slaughter at Omaha Beach believed, for approximately 3 hours, that they were witnessing the repulse of the Allied invasion. Radio intercepts translated and archived by the National Security Agency reveal that General Major Dietrich Kreis, commanding the 352nd Infantry Division, reported to his superiors at 0900 that the American assault had been decimated and that the beaches remained under German control. He was not wrong. At that moment, 9 hours into the largest amphibious invasion in human history, the outcome at Omaha Beach remained genuinely uncertain. Men were dying faster than they could advance. German artillery was finding its range. The tide was coming in, drowning wounded men who could not crawl fast enough up the beach. This was the edge. The moment when history could have turned differently. When the weight of German steel and the geometry of that killing ground might have proven too much. When the bodies floating in the surf and the screaming wounded and the sheer mathematical brutality of the defensive position might have broken the will of men to continue throwing themselves into machine gun fire. It did not. What happened instead, documented in hundreds of after-action reports and personal testimonies archived across American institutions, was something that defied military logic. Small groups of men, leaderless because their officers were dead, began moving up the bluffs. Not because of orders, not because of tactics, because staying on the beach meant certain death, and the only choice remaining was to attack. By noon, according to records held at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, American soldiers had punched through German defenses at 5 separate points along Omaha Beach. By 1300, they held the bluffs. By nightfall of June 6, 1944, 34,000 American troops occupied a beachhead that 6 hours earlier had been considered lost. The cost, according to the most reliable estimates compiled by military historians and archived at the National World War II Museum, between 2,400 and 3,000 American casualties at Omaha Beach alone on June 6th. Killed, wounded, missing. Bodies that washed up on French beaches for weeks afterward. Men buried in graves that would not be identified for months, some never, but the beachhead held. This is not a story about heroism, though there was heroism. This is not a story about strategy, though strategy brought them there. This is a story about what happens when ordinary men face a choice between certain death and probable death, and choose to move forward anyway. It is a story about the smell of blood in seawater, and the sound of machine guns, and the feeling of cold water at 52 degrees Fahrenheit, and how those sensations burned themselves into the memories of men who survived to build the world we inhabit today. The invasion of Normandy began in that water, in that blood, on that beach. Everything that followed, the liberation of France, the destruction of the Third Reich, the shape of the post-war world, began with men dying in the surf while machine guns turned the morning into mechanical thunder. This is that story. Not the sanitized version taught in schools, not the heroic narrative presented in memorials. The real story, constructed from archived documents and declassified reports and the testimonies of men who were there, who smelled the copper tang of blood in salt water and heard the screaming and felt the weight of equipment pulling them under, and decided somehow to keep moving forward. The story of D-Day begins with the water, 52 degrees Fahrenheit, and the men who stepped into it, knowing most of them would never step out, The planning began 2 years before the first man died in the surf at Omaha Beach. According to documents archived at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, the earliest conceptual planning for a cross-channel invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe commenced in April of 1942, when the strategic reality became mathematically clear to American and British planners. Germany could not be defeated from the air alone, could not be starved into submission by naval blockade alone, could not be contained on the periphery of Europe while maintaining a global war against Japan. Someone would have to put boots on the ground in France. Someone would have to breach the Atlantic Wall. Someone would have to assault fortified beaches against an enemy that had spent 4 years preparing to repel exactly such an invasion. The Americans knew what that meant. General Dwight David Eisenhower, appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in December of 1943, reviewed casualty projections that remain archived at the National Archives. These projections, compiled by military analysts using historical data from amphibious assaults at Tarawa, Anzio, and Salerno, estimated that the first wave at the primary invasion beaches could experience casualty rates approaching 75%. Some projections ran higher. The mathematics of amphibious assault against prepared defenses were brutally simple. Men in boats approaching a fortified shore move at predictable speeds, follow predictable paths, and present target-rich environments for defenders with overlapping fields of fire and pre-ranged artillery. Eisenhower understood. He was ordering men into a meat grinder. What the declassified records reveal, what separates myth from history, is the extraordinary level of deception and misdirection required to make the invasion possible at all. According to files held at the Central Intelligence Agency Historical Archive, the Allied Deception Plan, codenamed Operation Bodyguard and its sub-Operation Fortitude, represented the most elaborate strategic deception in military history. The Allies created an entirely fictional army group, the first United States Army group supposedly commanded by General George Patton, complete with fake radio traffic, dummy tanks, false supply depots, and fabricated intelligence deliberately leaked to German spies. The goal was simple: convince German High Command that the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, 150 miles northeast of the actual target at Normandy. It worked. German intelligence, as documented in captured Wehrmacht records, now held at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv and cross-referenced with American intelligence assessments, remained convinced through May of 1944 that Pas de Calais represented the primary invasion threat. This conviction would prove catastrophic for German defensive planning, as it resulted in the retention of significant panzer divisions and infantry reserves in the Pas de Calais region even after the Normandy landings commenced. But deception could only accomplish so much. Eventually, men would have to cross the Channel, and those men knew what awaited them. Private First Class Harold Baumgarten, assigned to Company B, 116th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, wrote a letter to his family on June 4, 1944, 2 days before the invasion, that is preserved in the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. In that letter, Baumgarten described the pre-invasion briefings, where officers showed maps of the Normandy coast, aerial reconnaissance photographs of German fortifications, and scale models of the beach obstacles. He described how the briefing officer explained, with clinical precision, the expected casualty rates for the first wave. He described the silence in the room when men realized they were looking at their own, deaths rendered in miniature on a plywood model. Baumgarten wrote that he was 20 years old and had never kissed a girl. He survived the landing. According to his testimony, archived and digitized, he watched 11 men die within arm's reach during the first 15 minutes on Omaha Beach. He was shot through the face. The bullet entered his left cheek and exited through his right cheek, shattering teeth and bone. He kept fighting. He survived the day with wounds that required months of reconstructive surgery. Decades later, he testified that the worst part was not the pain, not the fear, but the guilt. The inexplicable survivor's guilt that came from living when better men, stronger men, men with families and futures, died beside him for reasons that had nothing to do with courage or skill and everything to do with angles and trajectories and the randomness of ballistics. This is what the American planners knew they were creating. Not a battle, a lottery, a mechanical sorting of men into categories of dead, wounded, and alive, based on variables too complex and chaotic to predict or control. The invasion fleet assembled in ports across southern England during late May of 1944. According to the Naval History and Heritage Command, the Armada eventually comprised 5,000 vessels. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transport ships, landing craft, minesweepers, and support vessels. The scale defied comprehension. Aerial photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft and archived at the National Archives show portions of the English Channel, where ships were anchored so densely that a man could theoretically walk from vessel to vessel for miles without touching water. 160,000 men would cross the Channel on June 6th. Approximately 73,000 were American. The rest were British, Canadian, and forces from occupied nations fighting to liberate their homelands. The Americans drew two beaches, Utah on the western flank of the invasion sector and Omaha in the center. Utah was expected to be difficult. Omaha was expected to be hell. They were not wrong about Omaha. The bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach rose to heights of 100 to 170 feet, creating natural elevated firing positions that German engineers had spent 4 years fortifying. Declassified Wehrmacht engineering diagrams, captured after the war and archived at the National Archives, reveal the sophistication of the defensive network. 15 large-caliber guns in concrete casements, 35 pillboxes, 4 artillery positions, 18 anti-tank guns, 6 mortar pits, 35 rocket launching sites, and 85 machine gun nests. Every meter of the beach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Every approach was mined. Every obstacle was designed to channel attackers into pre-targeted killing zones. American intelligence knew about most of this. What they did not know, what would only become clear during the battle itself, was that the German 352nd Infantry Division, a full-strength, combat-experienced division, had recently moved into positions directly behind Omaha Beach during a routine rotation. American planners had expected to face a lower-quality static defense division. Instead, the first waves would assault a beach defended by veterans who had fought on the Eastern Front. The final pre-invasion briefing occurred on the evening of June 5, 1944. According to multiple accounts archived at the Army Heritage and Education Center, Eisenhower visited paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, who would jump behind enemy lines hours before the beach landings. Photographs from that visit, held at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, show the Supreme Commander moving among men who would soon be scattered across the Norman countryside, many of them killed before dawn. Eisenhower's expression in those photographs reveals a man carrying the weight of knowledge, that thousands of these men would die, that some of the deaths would result from his decisions, and that there was no alternative to sending them forward. That same evening, Eisenhower drafted a statement accepting full responsibility in the event the invasion failed. The document, archived and authenticated, reads in part, "Our landings have failed, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air and the navy, did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. He placed this statement in his wallet. He would carry it until the success of the invasion became certain. The men boarded the landing craft in darkness during the early morning hours of June 6th. According to testimonies compiled by the Veterans History Project, the crossing was rough, the channel was choppy, many men became violently seasick, and the confined steel spaces of the Higgins boats smelled of vomit and diesel fuel and fear. Men vomited on themselves. Men prayed. Men wrote final messages on scraps of paper and tucked them into pockets, hoping that if they died, someone would find the notes and send them home. Sergeant John Robert Slaughter, Company D, 116th Infantry Regiment, described in archived testimony the moment when the naval bombardment began. At approximately 0550, battleships and cruisers offshore opened fire on German positions. The sound, transmitted through the steel hull of the landing craft, was so loud that men could not hear themselves think. The concussion of naval gunfire created physical pressure waves that rattled equipment and shook men's bones. For 30 minutes, thousands of tons of high-explosive shells hammered the Norman coast. Then, the bombardment stopped, and in the silence that followed, men heard a different sound. Machine gun fire, already, reaching out across the water toward the approaching landing craft. The American vision of D-Day, the plan constructed over 2 years of staff work and strategic analysis, anticipated heavy casualties, but ultimate success based on overwhelming force, naval gunfire support, aerial bombardment, and armored support from amphibious tanks. The plan assumed that preliminary bombardment would suppress German defenses sufficiently to allow infantry to reach the seawall and begin the process of breaching the bluffs. Reality deviated from the plan within minutes of the first landings. The amphibious Sherman tanks, designed to provide immediate armored support for infantry, began launching from landing craft 6,000 yards offshore in rough seas. According to after-action reports from the 743rd Tank Battalion, archived at the National Archives, 27 of 29 tanks assigned to the first wave at Omaha Beach sank in the channel before reaching shore. The tanks, equipped with inflatable canvas flotation screens, proved unable to handle the sea conditions. Crews drowned inside steel coffins as the 30-ton vehicles disappeared beneath the waves. Only 2 tanks from the first wave reached the beach. The infantry would assault Omaha without the armored support the plan required. The naval bombardment, while spectacular, proved insufficient. Post-war analysis conducted by the Naval War College and archived in their historical collection concluded that the naval guns, firing from distances of 11 to 12,000 yards in rough seas, achieved hit rates below 15% against hardened German fortifications. Many shells landed inland behind the German positions. Some landed in the water. The bunkers and pillboxes remained operational. The aerial bombardment, executed by hundreds of heavy bombers in the hour before dawn, missed the beach entirely. According to the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, archived at the Air Force Historical Research Agency, bombardiers delayed their bomb releases by seconds, due to concerns about hitting the approaching invasion fleet in the darkness and cloud cover. Those seconds translated to miles. The bombs landed harmlessly inland, cratering empty fields while the beach defenses remained untouched. This meant that when the first ramps dropped at 0630, men stepped into a situation fundamentally different from what planners had anticipated. Instead of facing suppressed, disorganized defenders amid the rubble of destroyed fortifications, they faced alert, prepared German troops in intact positions with clear fields of fire and working weapons. The result was the slaughter described in testimonies archived across American institutions. Men cut down before reaching the water's edge. Men drowning in 3 feet of surf under the weight of equipment. Men shredded by machine gun fire that came from positions they could not see, could not suppress, could not avoid. Officers killed immediately, leaving units leaderless. Radios destroyed, leaving units unable to coordinate. Medics overwhelmed, running from wounded man to wounded man, knowing they lacked the supplies and time to save even a fraction of the bleeding soldiers. By 0700, according to V-Corps after-action reports, senior commanders aboard offshore vessels were receiving radio transmissions describing the landing as a failure, recommending evacuation, reporting that Omaha Beach had become an unsustainable killing ground. What those reports could not capture, what the archives preserve only through hundreds of individual testimonies, was the human experience of those moments. What it felt like to crouch behind a steel beach obstacle while machine gun bullets sparked off the metal inches from your face. What it sounded like when a mortar round landed in a group of men and the screaming started. What it looked like when you turned to speak to the man beside you and discovered he no longer had a face. What it meant to understand, with absolute clarity, that you were probably going to die in the next few minutes and there was nothing you could do about it, except try to kill the men who were killing you. This was the American vision of D-Day, reduced to its essential truth. Young men from democracy's industrial heartland, most of whom had never fired a shot in anger before that morning, learning in real time what their grandfathers learned at Belleau Wood and the Argonne. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to continue functioning while absolutely terrified. The Germans knew the invasion was coming. What they did not know was when, or where, or in what strength. That uncertainty paralyzed German strategic planning throughout the spring of 1944 and created the conditions that would ultimately doom the defense of Normandy before the first Allied soldier reached French soil. According to captured German military correspondence archived at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg and cross-referenced with Allied intelligence assessments held at the National Archives, the German High Command identified over a dozen potential invasion sites between Norway and the Spanish border. Each location offered different strategic advantages. Each required defensive preparation. But Germany in 1944 lacked the resources to defend every meter of European coastline with equal strength. Choices had to be made. Defenses had to be concentrated. And those concentrations had to be based on intelligence assessments about Allied intentions. German intelligence failed catastrophically. The Allied deception operations, Fortitude North suggesting a Norway invasion, Fortitude South suggesting Pas-de-Calais, convinced German commanders that Normandy represented, at most, a diversionary attack. This assessment persisted, not just in the hours before the invasion, but for weeks afterward. Intercepted German communications, declassified by the National Security Agency and archived in their historical collection, reveal that elements of the German command structure continued to believe that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais even as Allied forces consolidated their beachhead in Normandy. This strategic confusion had operational consequences that shaped the entire battle. But for the men in the bunkers overlooking Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6, 1944, strategic confusion was irrelevant. They knew exactly what was happening. They had trained for this moment. Some had been waiting for it for years. Grenadier Franz Gockel, serving with the 9th Company, 726th Grenadier Regiment, 352nd Infantry Division, provided testimony during post-war interviews conducted by American military historians. These interviews, archived at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, offer German perspective on the battle that American histories often omit. Gockel described the morning of June 6th from his position in a machine gun nest designated Widerstands Nest 62, Resistance Nest 62, overlooking the dog-green sector of Omaha Beach. His account is specific, detailed, and profoundly disturbing. Gockel stated that his unit had been alerted to the possibility of invasion during the pre-dawn hours of June 6th, when reports came in of paratroop drops inland. German doctrine assumed that airborne operations would precede any amphibious landing, so the alert status increased immediately. By 05:30, every position along the coast was manned and ready. When the Allied naval bombardment commenced at 05:50, German troops sheltered in deep bunkers and waited. Gockel remembered the bombardment as terrifying, but largely ineffective. The bunkers, constructed with steel-reinforced concrete walls 6 to 8 feet thick and covered with earth and camouflage, withstood the naval gunfire. Shells exploded around the positions, showering defenders with dirt and debris, but the structures themselves remained intact. When the bombardment lifted at 06:20, Gockel and his crew emerged from shelter and manned their weapon, an MG-42 machine gun with interlocking fields of fire designed to cover the beach approaches. What he saw made him certain of German victory. According to his testimony, the sea was filled with landing craft stretching to the horizon. Thousands of vessels. The scale was beyond anything German intelligence had predicted. For a moment, Gockel stated, he felt something close to despair. How could anyone defend against such numbers? But then his training reasserted itself. Numbers were irrelevant if those numbers could be killed before they reached defensive positions, and everything about the defensive layout at Omaha Beach was designed to do exactly that. The killing began when the first ramps dropped. Gockel described it with the dispassionate precision of a man who had disconnected emotion from action. The American soldiers emerged from the landing craft in dense groups. They were visible, exposed, moving slowly through water that impeded their movement. His machine gun, sighted at a range of 600 meters, did not require precision. He aimed at the center mass of groups and fired sustained bursts. The weapon cycled at 1,200 rounds per minute. At that rate of fire, a 3-second burst put 60 rounds into a target area, roughly 10 meters square. Men fell in groups. The water turned red. The wounded thrashed and drowned. The survivors tried to find cover behind beach obstacles that offered minimal protection against plunging fire from elevated positions. Gockel estimated, though he acknowledged the estimate was crude, that his gun crew killed or wounded over 200 men in the first hour of combat. Other crews reported similar numbers. The mathematics suggested that German defenders at Omaha Beach were achieving kill ratios that would be unsustainable for the attackers. If the rates held, the invasion would collapse through sheer attrition. But Gockel also remembered when he realized the defense would fail. The moment came around 0800, approximately 90 minutes into the battle. Despite catastrophic casualties, despite the killing field the beach had become, American soldiers continued landing. More boats, more men, wave after wave. Gockel had been trained to expect that attackers, faced with such losses, would withdraw or seek alternative landing sites. This was rational military doctrine. You do not continue assaulting a position where casualties exceed acceptable operational parameters. The Americans were not withdrawing. German defensive doctrine, as documented in Wehrmacht field manuals archived at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, assumed that determined defense at the water's edge would repel amphibious assaults. The doctrine was based on the reasonable assumption that attackers would behave rationally, would calculate odds, would preserve force when faced with unacceptable losses. The doctrine did not account for attackers who would continue to assault fortified positions despite casualty rates that approached or exceeded 50%. This was Germany's strategic failure rendered tactical, an inability to comprehend the industrial scale of resources and the cultural willingness to accept casualties that characterized American military operations in 1944. The United States was a nation that could afford to lose 3,000 men, taking a beach because it had millions more in training, millions more who could be mobilized, and an industrial base that produced weapons and equipment faster than they could be destroyed. Germany possessed no such depth. Every German soldier killed was irreplaceable. Every bunker destroyed stayed destroyed. Every strong point breached could not be reinforced. The asymmetry was mathematical and existential. Oberst Fritz Ziegelmann, operations officer for the 352nd Infantry Division, filed reports throughout June 6th that are preserved in captured German military archives. These reports, translated and archived at the National Archives, document the degradation of German defensive capabilities as the battle progressed. At 0700, Ziegelmann reported that the invasion had been repelled at most sectors, that casualties inflicted on American forces were severe, and that defensive positions remained intact. By 0900, he reported increasing pressure, casualties among defenders, and requests for artillery support. By 1100, he reported that American forces had achieved penetrations at multiple points, that strong points were being surrounded and reduced, and that defensive coherence was breaking down. By 1300, he reported that American forces controlled the bluffs and that organized defense of Omaha Beach had effectively collapsed. 6.5 hours. That is how long the prepared defenses, the Atlantic Wall, the 4 years of engineering and fortification, managed to hold against the weight of American industrial power applied with absolute determination. But those 6.5 hours extracted a price that shows in the archives. The casualty figures for the 352nd Infantry Division on June 6th remain imprecise. German record-keeping collapsed as the battle progressed. But post-war analysis suggests that the division sustained approximately 1,200 casualties, roughly 20% of its strength, in a single day. Many positions fought until overrun. Several bunkers had to be assaulted repeatedly because crews would not surrender even when surrounded and cut off from support. Grenadier Heinrich Severloh, manning another machine gun position at Waiterstands Nest 62, claimed in post-war testimony that he personally fired approximately 12,000 rounds during the battle, changing barrels multiple times as the weapon overheated. His testimony, controversial and impossible to fully verify, suggests individual kill counts that strain credulity. But the physical evidence, thousands of empty shell casings found in his position after the battle, documented in U.S. Army engineering surveys, confirms that someone in that position fired an enormous volume of ammunition at American soldiers crossing the beach. The German perspective on D-Day is inseparable from the knowledge of what came after. Every man fighting in those bunkers knew that Germany was losing the war. The Eastern Front had collapsed at Stalingrad and Kursk. Allied bombers were destroying German cities. The industrial capacity to replace losses no longer existed. The manpower to sustain a multi-front war was exhausted. Most German soldiers fighting at Normandy understood they were not fighting to win. They were fighting to delay the inevitable, to extract the highest possible cost for every meter of ground yielded, to make the Allies pay in blood for the liberation of Europe. Some fought because they believed in the Nazi cause. Some fought because military discipline and training overrode personal politics. Some fought because surrender to forces you had been shooting at all day seemed more dangerous than continuing to fight. And some fought because the alternative, accepting that 4 years of war, millions of dead, the destruction of their country, had been for nothing, was psychologically impossible to process while bullets were flying. The tactical competence of German forces at Omaha Beach is evident in the archives. These were not amateur soldiers. They were professionals executing a defensive plan with precision and discipline. Their fields of fire were calculated. Their ammunition was positioned for sustained combat. Their bunkers were designed to withstand naval bombardment. Everything that military engineering and tactical planning could accomplish, they accomplished. It was not enough. The material and manpower advantages the Allies brought to Normandy simply exceeded the capacity of defensive positions to absorb. German machine gun crews could kill American soldiers at a rate of dozens per minute. But when thousands of soldiers were landing every hour, when naval guns were systematically destroying bunkers, when tactical air support was eliminating artillery positions, when armored bulldozers were clearing obstacles and engineers were blowing gaps in obstacles, the mathematics turned inexorable. By nightfall on June 6th, American forces controlled a beachhead 6 miles wide and 1 to 2 miles deep at Omaha Beach. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. Thousands of American soldiers were ashore, and more were landing every hour. German counterattack forces that might have driven the invasion back into the sea remained positioned near Pays de Calais, held in reserve because German high command still believed the Normandy landing was a feint. For the German soldiers who survived June 6th, the experience marked a transition in understanding. Before Omaha Beach, some may have retained hope that superior German tactical skill could compensate for material disadvantage. After Omaha Beach, that illusion was no longer sustainable. They had executed their defensive plan perfectly. They had killed Americans in numbers that should have broken the assault. And the Americans had come anyway, had absorbed casualties that violated every assumption of military rationality, and had taken the beach through sheer material weight and willingness to die. The German vision of D-Day, preserved in after-action reports and post-war testimonies, is a vision of tactical success producing strategic failure. They won every local engagement and lost the battle. They killed more men than they lost, and still retreated. They did everything their training and doctrine required, and it made no difference to the outcome. This is the German perspective history sometimes forgets. D-Day was not a failure of German soldiers. It was a demonstration that no amount of courage, skill, or preparation could overcome the fundamental strategic reality of 1944. That Germany was fighting enemies with greater resources, greater industrial capacity, and greater willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of unconditional victory. The beachhead did not secure itself. What happened after the initial assault receives less attention in popular histories than the dramatic landings, but the archives reveal that the outcome of D-Day remained uncertain for days after June 6th. According to after-action reports compiled by First Army and archived at the National Archives, American forces at Omaha Beach spent June 7th through June 9th consolidating positions, clearing remaining German resistance, and expanding the beachhead inland against determined German counterattacks. The Germans did not simply retreat and surrender after losing the beaches. They fought for every field, every hedgerow, every village. Norman topography, small fields bounded by ancient hedgerows, 4 to 6 feet high, sunken roads, scattered farmhouses, created defensive terrain that negated American advantages in armor and mobility. German doctrine emphasized defense in depth, allowing attackers to penetrate initial positions before launching coordinated counterattacks with armor and infantry. This is what the Wehrmacht attempted in the week following D-Day. The critical German failure was not tactical, but operational. The inability to mass sufficient armored forces for a coordinated counterattack during the narrow window when such an attack might have succeeded. Intercepted German communications, declassified by the National Security Agency, reveal that General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B responsible for coastal defense, requested immediate release of panzer reserves positioned inland. These reserves, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, Panzer Lehr Division, and 21st Panzer Division, represented Germany's mobile operational reserve in France. But releasing these divisions required authorization from Adolf Hitler personally. And Hitler was asleep on the morning of June 6th. His staff, following standing orders not to wake the Führer unless absolutely necessary, delayed reporting the invasion until mid-morning. By the time Hitler authorized release of panzer reserves, Allied air superiority made daylight movement of German armor functionally suicidal. Panzer divisions attempting to reach the invasion beaches during daylight were subjected to continuous attacks by Allied fighter bombers. Movement occurred primarily at night, which slowed the concentration of forces and prevented coordinated counterattacks during the critical first 72 hours. According to German military records captured after the war, panzer divisions that should have reached the Normandy front within 24 hours required 4 to 6 days to complete movement from the assembly areas to combat positions. That delay, measured in hours and days, translated directly into thousands of additional Allied troops landed, thousands of tons of supplies offloaded, and transformation of vulnerable beachheads into fortified positions capable of repelling armored assault. By June 9th, according to Allied logistics reports archived at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Collection, over 326,000 troops, 54,000 vehicles, and 104,000 tons of supplies had been landed across all 5 invasion beaches. Omaha Beach alone had processed over 75,000 troops and the 12,000 vehicles. The temporary harbor facilities, Mulberry harbors prefabricated in England and towed across the Channel, were operational, allowing direct offloading of supplies without relying on captured port facilities. The scale of this logistical achievement is difficult to overstate. In 9 days, the Allies had constructed from nothing a supply infrastructure capable of sustaining multiple armies in combat operations. Every ton of food, every gallon of fuel, every round of ammunition, every replacement soldier, every vehicle, everything required to fight a modern industrial war, had to be shipped across the English Channel and offloaded on beaches under intermittent German artillery fire and occasional air attack. That this worked at all represents one of the great logistical accomplishments in military history. But logistics do not capture what those days felt like for the men fighting inland from the beaches. First-person accounts archived in the Veterans History Project describe a grinding, chaotic battle of small units struggling through terrain that favored defenders. Visibility in the hedgerow country rarely exceeded 100 meters. Armor had difficulty maneuvering. Artillery observers struggled to identify targets. Infantry advanced field by field, often taking casualties from German positions they could not see until literally stumbling upon fortified machine gun nests. Casualty rates during the first week of the Normandy campaign, documented in medical reports from First Army, remained severe. The fighting did not have the dramatic intensity of the beach assault, but it killed and wounded thousands of American soldiers through the accumulated friction of small unit combat, repeated hundreds of times across the beachhead perimeter. The German counterattacks, when they finally materialized, came piecemeal and uncoordinated. The 12th SS Panzer Division launched attacks against Canadian positions near Caen on June 7th and 8th. Panzer Lehr Division engaged British forces west of Caen on June 9th and 10th. 21st Panzer Division conducted limited attacks against the seam between American and British sectors. Each attack achieved local tactical success. German armor repeatedly demonstrated superior tactical proficiency compared to green American and British tank crews. But tactical success could not overcome the fundamental operational reality. Allied forces had air superiority, naval gunfire support, and overwhelming material advantage. German panzer attacks that might have succeeded on the Eastern Front, where both sides fought without air superiority and with comparable resources, failed in Normandy because Allied fighter-bombers destroyed German armor during approach marches. Allied naval gunfire shattered German assembly areas, and Allied replacement capabilities meant that destroyed Allied tanks were replaced within days, while destroyed German tanks were irreplaceable. The historical significance of D-Day cannot be separated from what it enabled strategically. The Normandy beachhead became the launching point for Operation Overlord, the liberation of Western Europe. Within weeks, Allied forces had broken out of the beachhead, liberated Paris, and begun the drive toward Germany itself. Within a year, Germany surrendered unconditionally. But this outcome was not foreordained. The archives make clear that D-Day could have failed. If the weather had remained poor for another day, if German reserves had been released immediately, if the deception operations had failed to fix German forces at Pas-de-Calais, if any of a dozen operational factors had shifted even marginally, the invasion could have resulted in catastrophic Allied losses and political pressure to seek negotiated settlement rather than unconditional surrender. The men who died at Omaha Beach did not die for an inevitable victory. They died creating the possibility of victory through their willingness to assault fortified positions despite knowing the probable cost. And yet the final accounting of D-Day casualties remains imprecise. The Department of Defense, in official casualty reports archived at the National Archives, estimates total Allied casualties on June 6th at approximately 10,000 across all beaches, with 4,000 confirmed dead. American casualties at Omaha Beach specifically are estimated at 2,400 to 3,000, with roughly a third of those killed in action. These numbers are approximations. The chaos of combat made precise casualty tracking impossible, and some men listed as missing were never found. German casualties are even more difficult to determine. Post-war estimates based on captured records suggest between 4,000 and 9,000 German casualties on June 6th, but these figures lack the documentation to be considered definitive. Many German units were destroyed or scattered, and their records were lost. What the numbers cannot capture is the human experience those statistics represent. Every casualty figure is a person, a name, a family that received a telegram, a mother who answered the door to find an officer standing with a folder containing the words, "Regret to inform you," a wife who became a widow, a child who grew up without a father, brothers who died together, friends separated by 50 feet of beach who never saw each other again. The cemeteries tell part of the story. The Normandy American Cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer overlooks Omaha Beach. 9,387 American dead are buried there, their graves marked by white crosses and stars of David arranged in perfect rows stretching across manicured lawns. Many graves are marked, known only to God, unidentified remains that could not be matched to names despite forensic efforts. According to cemetery records maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission, families of soldiers killed at Normandy were given the choice to return remains to the United States or allow burial in France. Roughly 60% chose burial in France. These are the men who stayed. The Germans buried their dead in a separate cemetery at Le Camp, 6 miles inland from Omaha Beach. 21,000 German soldiers are buried there, many in mass graves marked by dark stone crosses. The contrast between the American cemetery and the German cemetery is visually striking and historically significant. The American cemetery represents victory, sacrifice validated by success, honor granted to those who died liberating occupied nations. The German cemetery represents defeat, sacrifice rendered meaningless by their cause's moral bankruptcy, a memorial to men who fought bravely for an evil regime. Both cemeteries share one truth. Everyone buried there was once young, once alive, once someone's son or brother or father. The strategic outcome of D-Day reshaped the post-war world. The successful invasion ensured that Western Europe would be liberated by Anglo-American forces rather than Soviet forces advancing from the east. This geographic reality determined the political boundaries of the Cold War. Western Germany, France, Belgium, the Netherlands. These nations were rebuilt under democratic governance with American economic assistance because American soldiers had liberated them rather than Soviet soldiers. The map of post-war Europe, the division between NATO and Warsaw Pact, the entire structure of the Cold War, originated in the decision to launch Operation Overlord and the success of D-Day. From this perspective, the men who died at Omaha Beach did not die simply to liberate France. They died to shape the political architecture of the late 20th century. They died to ensure that Western Europe would be rebuilt as democratic, market-oriented societies aligned with American strategic interests rather than Soviet-dominated satellite states. Whether they understood this at the time is doubtful. According to testimonies archived across American institutions, most soldiers at Omaha Beach were focused on immediate survival, on reaching the seawall, on not dying in the next few seconds. Grand strategy was the concern of generals and politicians. The men in the landing craft were concerned with the water temperature and the machine gun fire, and whether they would live to see tomorrow. But intentions and outcomes are not identical. The soldiers who fought at Omaha Beach participated in a historical moment whose consequences exceeded their understanding or control. Their actions, their willingness to continue moving forward while men died around them, created the military victory that enabled everything that followed. The final word belongs to those who were there. The archives preserve thousands of testimonies from D-Day veterans. Some describe heroism. Some describe cowardice. Most describe chaos, confusion, fear, and the incomprehensible randomness of survival. Men who should have died lived. Men who should have lived died. There is no pattern, no justice, no explanation beyond ballistics and geometry. What emerges from these testimonies is not a simple narrative of heroism conquering evil. What emerges is complexity. Men who were terrified, but fought anyway. Men who froze and could not move. Men who broke under fire and had to be pulled forward by others. Men who displayed courage they did not know they possessed. Men who discovered they were capable of violence they could not reconcile with their pre-war identities. The greatest service we can do to those men is to tell the truth about what happened. Not the sanitized version taught in schools, not the heroic myth presented at memorial ceremonies. The truth documented in archives and preserved in testimonies, that D-Day was chaos and slaughter and confusion and courage and cowardice all mixed together in proportions that varied from man to man, moment to moment, across 6 miles of French beach on a morning in June when the weather was bad and the water was cold, and thousands of young men died to create a future they would never see. That future is the world we inhabit. Democratic Western Europe, NATO, the post-World War II international order. All of it traces back to that beach, that morning, those men. We owe them memory. We owe them truth. We owe them the honesty to acknowledge that what they did was both necessary and terrible, both heroic and horrifying, both strategically essential and humanly tragic. The water was 52 degrees Fahrenheit, and the men who stepped into it changed history.